Welcome, everyone. Today we are going to look at sex-linked traits. So, here's how it is. Today we're going to look at the difference between a sex-linked trait and what's known as an autosomal trait. All right? And next is be able to determine the different inheritance patterns that we would see with sex-linked traits. And that way we can tell the difference between a sex-linked trait and an autosomal trait. So those are our two learning targets for today. All right, so without further ado, let's begin. Here's how it works out. If we were to take the chromosomes of a very simple organism like a fruit fly, you would see it has a total of 8 chromosomes. And of those 8 chromosomes, 6 of them are going to be what we consider autosomes. The next two, or the last 2 chromosomes, are the sex chromosomes. They determine the biological sex of the organism. And in this case, there are 2 X's, and that means that we have a biological female fruit fly. You can tell this because the base of the fruit fly is still tan-colored and not darker, and it doesn't have the sex chromosomes on its forelimbs. On the other hand, if one of those 2 sex chromosomes was a Y, then that means we wouldn't have a biological female fruit fly, we would have a male fruit fly, which we can see has a dark abdomen and has the sex chromosomes on the forelimbs of its front 2 legs. So that's a big difference between these two. They have different chromosomes, and it's only the sex chromosomes that are different. The autosomes are exactly the same. It doesn't matter if it is male or if it's female, but the sex chromosomes are different. And that means that we're going to have some different inheritance patterns if something happens to be on a sex chromosome. How they figured this out is when they were breeding fruit flies, what occurred is when they bred a male and a female, they ended up with, well, all red-eyed fruit flies. Which makes sense because the fruit fly parents both had red eyes, and so then all the offspring also had red eyes. But at one point in time, when they bred 2 red-eyed fruit flies, the results looked something like this. They got 25% of the offspring had these white eyes. So 75% had red eyes, but 25% of the offspring had white eyes. And this meant that it must have been a recessive trait because it skipped the parental generation. It was hidden. It was not shown. It was not expressed in the parents, but all of a sudden showed up in the offspring. But something else really important happened with this. See, what we would guess is that you should end up with 50% of the white-eyed offspring being male and 50% of the white-eyed offspring being female. But in fact, what occurred was that 100% of the white-eyed individuals were all male. There were 0 white-eyed females. So there must have been something different about the males than the females. And the only area where the males are different from the females genetically is with the sex chromosomes. So this trait must have been linked to a sex chromosome. The question is, which one? So as we look at this, again, the trait, it was not expressed in our P generation, and that tells us that it must be recessive. Also, it appeared disproportionately in males. Males showed the trait, females did not show the trait at all. So, because you ended up with the trait sometimes in males, but not in females, that told us it must have been involved on the sex chromosomes. So now let's look at those sex chromosomes and how they actually get passed down. If we were to take a simple Punnet square, the female, she'll be XX. She has 2 X chromosomes. The male will be XY because the male has an X and a Y chromosome. They only have 1 chromosome of each. And if you fill in this Punnet square like you're used to, you have XX, XX, those would both be female, and then the bottom XY and XY, those would both be biologically male. The top 2 obviously received an X from each parent. The 2 males received their X from the female and their Y from the male. And one of those represents the white-eyed individuals. And the only thing different between the white-eyed individual males and the regular-eyed individual males is the X that they received. The Y from the male parent would be the exact same for both. The only thing that could actually be different is which X chromosome they got from their female parent. So how do we look at this? Well, the way it actually looks is that we have these two different alleles, and this is something that you're very familiar with already. You have the allele for the red eyes, that's dominant, and you have the allele for white eyes, that's recessive. Next, we also know that the gene for eye color is found on the X chromosome, and so we're going to include both the X chromosome and the allele together when we're actually differentiating this. So we would show it as X with a superscript capital R for the red eye and X with a superscript lowercase r for the white eyes. So putting that all together, this is how a Punnet square could look to end up with a white-eyed male offspring. The way it works, again, filling out a Punnet square exactly how we're used to, except in this case, now we have both the sex chromosomes as well as the allele for eye color represented. And what we can see is that 75% of the individuals would all have red eyes, 100% of the females and 50% of the males. But that last 50% of males, that is going to have white eyes. Could you end up with a white-eyed female? Yes, but only under very specific circumstances. First, you need to have a white-eyed male parent. Second, you must have at minimum a heterozygote female parent. Otherwise, the female cannot pass on the recessive allele. If she's homozygous recessive, if she has white eyes as well, this would also work. The male, again, would have the recessive allele and then the Y. The male only has one X chromosome, so they cannot be heterozygous. They can only show whatever they have on their X chromosome. They only have one, so whatever's on that X chromosome must show up. And here we have that 50% of the females will actually end up with white eyes. So there's our white-eyed female right there. If the female parent had white eyes and the male parent had white eyes, then, well, 100% of their offspring will have white eyes because that's the only allele that would be present. There would be no red eye allele in either of the parents. So you can only end up with white eyes. If the male parent had red eyes, the female offspring cannot have white eyes because he always donates his X chromosome to the female offspring. And if he had red eyes, that means he has the red eye allele, and that means that they will end up with the red eye allele. And it doesn't matter what the female parent has. The red eye allele will overshadow or mask a white-eyed allele all the time. When we talk about this, generally speaking, we look at the X-linked recessive traits, but that is not the only type of sex-linked trait that exists. We look at those because a female can actually mask that trait because the female can be heterozygous. And a male can't mask that trait because the male only has one X chromosome, and thus they can't be heterozygous. So it typically shows up more often in a male than in a female. Or it could have been an X-linked dominant trait, which would be like the red eye trait. And what we see there is the male always passes that trait on to their female offspring. And it never passes that trait on to the male offspring because it only has a Y that it will pass on to the male offspring. The females they may pass that trait along to their offspring. It depends on if they're heterozygous or not. It depends on what alleles they have. And next, a Y-linked trait, where a Y-linked trait has to be attached to the Y chromosome, which means it will never show up in females, and a male parent will always pass that trait on to their male offspring. In conclusion, some alleles are attached to the sex chromosomes, and that means when we are going to write them down, we like to differentiate which chromosome they are attached to, just to make sure that we are keeping track of where they are. Next, because they're not on autosomal chromosomes, they don't follow the exact same inheritance patterns as autosomal chromosomes. And so we have a completely different inheritance pattern when it comes to the sex-linked traits. Depends on if it's on the X or if it's on the Y. Remember, the majority that we're going to look at are going to be X-linked recessive, because that means it can be hidden in the female, but it will always be expressed in the male. That's it for this time. Be awesome, stay awesome.